morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. Hopefully you've had your coffee so you can be alert. I will let you know that minor chuckles will produce a much better presentation. So, I can see that we have our normal church seating here, so I think this is vacant. So this is Courage Under Fire, which was a presentation I originally developed during the middle of COVID. I'm sure none of you can think of a good reason for that. I caught the presentation from Mankato from Jody, and he was like, oh, that was pretty crazy stuff that happened from a small statement. And so some of this might overlap some of those things, so I have no way to make that not happen, I guess. So just cross your fingers. So, as board members, you guys certainly have been doing it for a while. Superintendents, at some point it's going to happen where you're in a situation where somebody is upset, angry, and maybe they've hit a point where their emotions are getting a little bit better over them. And that's where a lot of this comes from. And you feel like you have the proverbial angry mob coming after you. And that can be very difficult, and that's one of the reasons you often hear people say, like, you got to grow some thick skin, as they say. But any of you that are currently working on that, that takes time, kind of like calluses on your fingers.
Excuse me.
So a lot of what's in this presentation comes from this book, Escaping the School Leader's Dunk Tank. And it's a very good read. It has a lot of examples and scenarios. If you have the conference app, I think you'll be able to click on that link. That's the Principal Center interview of the authors. It's a very good read. It can give a lot of examples. And if you are currently going through something, which is when I read the book, that can help provide some validation and insight. So, you ever feel like you're in the room with the proverbial finger being wagged at you? And if you guys don't mind entertaining me, I'll point there. Yeah, and so this is more my own thoughts on this particular slide, but I think it's good advice. So first off, you will never make everyone happy. Like if you are here and you think you're going to make everybody happy, just quit while you're ahead. And my experience is, if you are making everybody happy, probably not doing your job. Some people you will never make happy, even if you walk on water. That's a joke me and my wife like to make. Some people, and we'll kind of get more into that, just have something against you and they want to find a fault with it. And as you'll hear later, that usually has more to do with something with them than it does with you. So even if you manage perfection, and nobody ever will, you'll still be doing it wrong. And so that's easily the third one. And so focus on what the right call is. And this is good advice for anybody that's a leader, because at the end of the day, if you are catching grief because of decisions you made, you can at least sleep good at night. I remember one situation where I had to discipline a child as a principal, and the child who was a perpetrator happened to be a person who had a name in the community, sort of thing. And the person that was a recipient was somebody that was in trouble a lot, that sort of thing. And I caught a lot of flack for it, but I don't feel bad about it because I stood up for what I saw. And it was kind of an odd situation because I got accused of favoring the kid that I swear I probably suspended the most while I was there. But as you'll see later, logic sometimes likes to suspend itself. And that's definitely something, like any of you that are experienced board members, if you raise your hand if you've seen logic suspended. Yes, and so first point on this one is pay attention to your gut. So since originally making this presentation, I've encountered some research, and people are generally good at sensing something's off, but just as a caveat, you're not necessarily good at sensing why. So just keep that in mind. So if you're interacting with somebody and the response seems excessive or extreme or doesn't make sense, there's probably more to it. So just keep the second caveat in mind that you might not be able to pick up the why, but you're probably right that something's amiss. And this is a very important one for this slide. It is often not about you. It can be tempting, especially the educators you work with, and I imagine you being on school boards, you probably have that same mentality. You want to help, you want to do good, and it can be tempting when you are under fire to think that you're doing something wrong. And the important thing is that it's not always about you, because a lot of times if you spend too much time trying to figure out what you're doing wrong, you might miss the fact it doesn't have anything to do with that. And that can alleviate some frustration. So here are some emotional triggers, and in reflecting on this, we all have these emotions, and it's how we manage them that really makes them good or bad. But to this presentation, this has to do when those emotions start suspending logic, when people's actions don't start making sense. Like when you have somebody that is demoted to a lower position, but they're still getting an administrative salary, doesn't really make sense, but I've seen that happen just despite somebody. So, not the best decision with your finances, but like I said, logic gets suspended sometimes. So jealousy is probably one we're all familiar with. I had a person I met in high school once who, when I first met him, we got along really well, and all of a sudden, like, after me all the time, and eventually kind of figured out, like, his parents had gotten divorced and mine were together, and it bothered him, and so he didn't cope with that well. But I'm sure you guys can think of a lot of good examples of jealousy. But basically, wanting something you have. So it's not about you, it's something they want. You happen to have it. Revenge. Any of you who are school administrators and board members, I'm certain you'll experience this too, but like, you did something they don't agree with, they need to get back at you. And this can happen with a lot of things. So the next one, connectivity or association. That's an interesting one, because sometimes you didn't do anything. You are just associated with somebody. So I remember this one situation where I had a parent file like a social services type claim against a teacher, and it was kind of odd to me. I remember at the time that's where my gut was kicking in, because like what she did it on, certainly there was reason to be upset with, but like to file like a negligence or child abuse kind of claim seemed pretty out of whack. I later found out she happened to be best friends with somebody that just despised this teacher, and so I also had the benefit once of having 3 supervisors, one that liked me, one that didn't, and sometimes I got caught in the middle of that. But it didn't really have much to do with me, as I said. Skepticism and validity. A lot of times this is someone that maybe thinks they know more, or they're more qualified, and so they want to second guess and things like that. And so discrimination and racism and nepotism. All these have like the same underlying outcome. It's that people aren't being treated the same. So discrimination is a word that gets thrown around a lot right now, and it certainly exists where somebody's treated different because of some sort of ethnic background. I had a teacher once that was getting a lot of complaints, and when I compared them to the other teachers around this individual, it wasn't making sense. They were being accused of like taking pictures in the locker room, having an explosive temper, and that wasn't the case. And I remember talking to one of the parents and like kind of pointing out like, why are you so concerned with this individual? And they happen to be a teacher of color, and I do genuinely believe that has to be a racist thing. Nepotism isn't too far behind. Some of us work in really small schools, so people can have a lot of connections. And sometimes people might make sure that their friends or relatives get certain positions, and sometimes that's a way to insulate bad behavior because they have a connection. And certainly there's good reasons to hire people that you have connections with. You just got to make sure that you're hiring people that are qualified to do positions. That's something to watch out with discrimination and nepotism. Being held accountable. So definitely any superintendents here, and as board members, I'm sure you've encountered this too. But like a lot of times if somebody has been doing something for a while and you come along and say, that's not right, you're not going to shake your hand and say, thank you very much for letting me know I was breaking the rules. I knew one superintendent who had a head cook that would take the leftovers to downtown and share with her friends. And he tried to say, that's not right. It was illegal for one. But that person had a lot of friends due to that, and kind of got nipped in the butt when he tried to say that, you know, you need to stop doing that, you're way over budget, like you're not supposed to do this. But yeah, he was quite upset that he was told that something that he'd been doing for years and getting away with wasn't something he should have been doing in the first place. Entitlement. I think we see a lot of this these days. Somebody just feels they're owed something, and so sometimes in this situation that you didn't give them what they felt they were owed. Again, it has more to do with them. They feel like due to maybe their longevity or stuff they've done for the district or position in the community, that they should get a certain spot, job, title, whatever it is, and you don't give it, and sometimes that can be an emotional trigger. Ego and power. Usually, ego or power has more to do with the person like wanting to flex that they have that ego or power. Sometimes they're covering up their own insecurities where they might feel like they're not in control of something, and so they want to exercise the control they do have. And the thing to be careful is sometimes when this happens, there's a lack of concern for who you might run over in the process to demonstrate that you have control over the situation. And so the important thing of knowing a lot of these emotions is sometimes you can kind of get to the root of where it's coming from, so you don't go on a rabbit hole, like I said, thinking that it's just about you. So fear is usually a complementing emotion. Usually it's tied with one of these, and usually these things don't happen in isolation. Usually there's fear going on. But the important thing to note about fear is a lot of times it can sustain kind of these charged emotions, and it can sustain bad behavior because you think you need to do it in order to survive type thing. So like perhaps you feel like your power is being challenged and you really think you might lose that job that you worked so hard to get, and you might inspire somebody to engage in some of the behaviors in this next slide. But for some of these things, ringing with anybody out there, have you experienced that, seen them? See a lot of head shaking, nodding. Was that
all of the above?
Yes. Yeah, and that was one of the interesting things about the book, was that in the next slide they have 10 strategies that are surprisingly common. You would think that they'd be all over the map. But there's a lot of similarities with a lot of these things. Is anybody willing to share a story where the names were changed and locations shifted? So the only problem with this presentation is usually that nobody wants to share a story in case somebody goes back and say, hey, it's all right, I'll keep going, but if you have anything to share, feel free to do so. So these are adversarial tactics that probably have become frighteningly common in the last few years, let's be frank. But sometimes if you can know what the strategy is and kind of sense where that driver is coming from, it'll get you a lot closer than if you're kind of like just grasping at straws. So creating rumors. In this day and age, that's really easy with social media. So raise your hand if there are certain social media platforms you'd like to set on fire and throw out a window. I thought you'd be sympathetic to that. So like, I have a really good example of one. I once was working on a building project, and it was kind of odd. We passed like this, in North Dakota, they have a thing called a building levy, and you go to a vote to get authority to levy it. We got through all of that. It passed. And I got to this last public meeting where we were just going to sign off on the contract with the company to do it. And so there was somebody that got voted off a high-level position. I'll be a little vague in details for the same reasons I mentioned before. And they were actually involved in the process to develop this plan. What they did is they went around town because everybody was angry about taxes. And they told people the meeting was about taxes and you should come and give Mr. Ludvigson a piece of your mind. And they did. It was delightful. I will say I was able to, once I figured out why they were there and angry, to redirect the conversation. It did successfully nip the plan in the butt, unfortunately, but at least I got out of the room. Creating silos. This is something that can happen just through poor communication, but sometimes somebody shares information selectively with one group to try to pit them against each other, or to influence an action where, if you did proper communication with everybody, it would function a little bit differently. And like I said, sometimes it's just bad communication. I'm sure you've dealt with, like, well, that's not our department, and you make a phone call. But sometimes that can be used as a tactic to get back at somebody too. Professional courtesy. What that means is like extending a privilege or something, like maybe you make sure so-and-so's requisitions get approved, or the complaint against so-and-so magically disappears in the process. And usually it's a way to keep their allies with them. So like, I'm providing this to you, you better do what I want. Otherwise I'll make sure that complaint comes. I'm not sure if I've experienced a lot, it probably has happened, but like I said, people are probably not going to come forward and say that they're doing any of this stuff. It's just stuff you suspect. Slowing down an organization, I had a fun one with that. There was a person once that was upset with an administrator, and they had filed a grievance. And I'm actually 504 trained in investigation, so like I try to do a very thorough one, and which probably benefited me in the end in this, for the record. But they kept filing a grievance on this and that, and at one point they did an open records request for the notebook the guy was carrying around from last, like a certain year. I had to go to him because open, like, do you still have that? And he didn't, so he didn't have to keep it. But like, I'm sure you can sense the kind of bizarre quality it got. And eventually they did quit, but like, I did a lot of investigating, and it was triggered because they were upset with an individual. Actually came back to like somebody being able to play sports. Couldn't believe that. Spoiler, somebody couldn't play. So intentional omission. This one's like more powerful than it might seem. It's like providing somebody information but leaving out a critical detail that they know will shift your decision. And what that does is cause your judgment to be questioned. So you made this decision and you failed to consider this important factor, and now you look like a doofus. I know it's happened to me. I don't have like a really story right off the cuff, but I'm sure somebody here has experienced that. But let's see. Nepotism, I kind of touched on that one a little bit. But getting a friend to go do, they don't have to be a relative. That's the one thing I wanted to emphasize. They just need to have some sort of connection, and they're using that trying to get through to somebody. Like, I actually had a situation where there was somebody on my staff who was very good at this. And basically, they'd go tell X person something that riled them up, and they went and did something, and they got in trouble. But it took me a long time to figure out where the rabbit hole ended. And the day I figured it out, and I just came to her, and this is the stuff I see, and she quit the next day. So, by the way, I'm a bad guy. Misusing information.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
In that situation, did you say I'm a backup?
I was the bad guy.
Okay.
Oh, back.
Oh, you were the bad guy.
I know, we're like.
I couldn't understand what you're saying. But no, my question is around that situation, if the person doesn't quit, how do you then navigate from that? Like, let's say you have one grade level cohort that is just aggravated about something, or something in the building, or a person in the building, just whatever it is, whether it's the janitor's not cleaning our rooms correctly, or, how do you get it when it's one big giant cohort of like 4 teachers or 5 teachers that are getting on the bandwagon of one of their teachers in that group to then cause chaos within the rest of the district?
Well, I'll answer that in 2 parts. One is, sometimes this is a sign that your organization's unhealthy, and that the way the people are getting ahead, getting things done, is through these tactics. So if somebody feels like the only way they can get their need met is through making rumors so that somebody has to go and like fix the rumor or whatever, that's a sign that it's unhealthy, and you probably need to work with your administration on how can we provide proper communication channels, proper input, and caveat with that, it will take a while. The second part of it is if you really have like a single nexus, by no means do I have a silver bullet, but I find documentation is extremely important, and to keep good records, particularly of your administrative staff who's doing supervision, because what I have found is, like in my example, I kept copious notes, and I went back to them. In my meeting with them, I actually just said, these are the facts I have. And I said, what should I make of them? So I didn't actually accuse the person of anything. But like, if they stay on, the hard part is you'll have to prove it. If you can't prove it, I would recommend finding ways to limit their ability depending on the strategy to do it. So like, gossiping and negativity is probably the hardest one to put a cap on. Some of these are a little easier, like the working from the inside. That's where somebody has access to information and they share it where they can't. Well, that person you could probably move to a different job or something. Like my example with that one, quick, is that, and this is one that has a good ending, because like the person, sometimes people that fall into this are good enough people, but they develop bad habits. And so when I started at a particular position, there was a bad relationship with the board at the time and one of the bus contractors. And one of the bus contractor's girlfriend was worked in the central office. So information would go out, and I remember sitting down with her and I said, it's not necessary. If you think there's something I should tell them, I'll call them. And it took a while, but eventually that's what she did. Hey, like, I think they would really like to know this. And so I called them. That avoided a lot of drama. So, but those things do take time, and you want to put most of your energy into your positive people. You want to make sure those people that are your champions, those people that are representing your values of your district, are the ones being heard. Because if that person that is the loudest, most obnoxious, or just is the biggest thorn in your possible side you can imagine is winning, other people will think they need to do the same in order to get your attention. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Unfortunately, I have no like silver bullets. You probably weren't expecting I had one. So, deflection. We all do deflection. By the way, if you have questions at any time, feel free. Deflection is usually a vulnerability the person feels in that situation, like the fear one. And so the most common example I have, I've done a lot of teacher evaluations, like, hey, you have an issue with classroom management. What about B? And this one will happen a lot just when people are feeling uncomfortable and attacked too. But in those situations, keep it focused on the fact, keep it focused on the person. If they bring up something that really needs addressed, say, we're going to put a tab in that and I'll come back to it later. Because otherwise, well, I'm sure you've watched in plenty of classrooms where it's, hey, teacher, how's the weather? And suddenly it's 15 minutes into class and it's like, what does this have to do with mathematics? All right. Creating paranoia, it's feeding the fear. And that one can be dangerous because fear is a pretty good driver for illogical behavior. So like in that situation I gave with the taxes, they were afraid they were going up. So feed them information. So I'll kind of tie that to the rumors. I think I skipped over this, but the reason that strategy worked for the individual is he knew you would believe what I said. You wouldn't ask any questions, because have you heard of confirmation bias? Well, it's a great way, I have learned, and some students are really good at this too, for the record. If I tell you something you want to believe, you won't ask me a whole lot of questions, you'll just run with it. And so, trying to get people back to facts is sometimes difficult. And sometimes you don't start with the person that's causing it. Sometimes you start with the person that got piggybacked along. Like, here's the facts. Because sometimes because of the way things are, all you can do is like trim down the number of people they're falling for it, so to speak. And communication is always good. Extending and bending rules is one that's pretty related to professional courtesy. But do we have some questions at this point? How many of you have seen some of this stuff play out? Anybody willing to share a story where you changed the names and locations?
Well, I can tell you about intentional omission. I'm a board member and I work in a bank, so it's really interesting to hear people when they come in and they only tell you half the story. You don't get the whole thing, and it's challenging sometimes to get all the information out as to why they're doing something or not doing something. So I run into intentional omission fairly frequently. You know, your better customers don't have that. The ones that are borderline or having some trouble are the ones that generally will omit that, omit that information, and if you can drill down to find out what the real root of the problem is, it seems to always have a better outcome.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, because one of the things I've noticed that happens with this is a lot of times these strategies like put attention away from the actual sense, the thing that they're upset about, the thing that's making them mad. Deflection's the most direct example, but like all those grievances I was getting filed, it was because they were upset about the playtime thing, like their kid couldn't play for a year due to some, you know, rules or whatever, and somebody played a role in that. But a lot of times these things will send you down a different path, and your story reminded me, I recently heard of one where some person came in and said, you know, so-and-so had a fight with me, and then the principal took a look in it and says, well, he said, well, I guess I did tell him his daddy was a milkman. Well, that's a convenient detail to leave out. That's probably why he wanted to sock you.
I would say that it's important to look at these things and recognize where you fall into some of these issues. Like in the first slide, fear. I fell into a lot of fear during making a decision about mask wearing and the threats that were made. And then it made me make some choices personally, and it wasn't publicly, right? But my response, while I had that fear, kind of just really infiltrated a lot of decisions I made. And the other thing that I think that the country has fallen into is that we surround ourselves with people like us, and I'm on a board with people that are not like me. And how do I really make sure that I don't look at other board members as the bad guys or the whatever it is? And this last 3 days have been very helpful. We have new board members, and I need to get to know them as humans instead of the bad guys. And I think that it's important that we really are self-reflective of where our fear, our emotion, our sense of justice and freedom, those types of things, how do we listen to the people on our side, yet also listen to the people on other sides, and where are there similarities and the same concerns? As I think about a family member, maybe a decade ago, that was, you know, on the other side of gun control. And then we sat down, and my emotions, my fear is my kid's gonna get killed in a school. And his emotion and his fear is that somebody is gonna come into my home and take my gun, right? Now, I know that I'm coming from a place of fear, and that although my fear could happen, most kids don't get killed in their school. And in my opinion, his was illogical, as opposed to thinking somebody's actually gonna enter his home and take his guns. But when we talked, we got to the point where he agreed there should be some regulation. And although I, in my fear, might have been way over here, I recognized it was fear, and I didn't want all guns to be gone. We came to like, oh yeah, that regulation we both agree with. And this way that we're gonna monitor how many guns, and we came up with some creative ideas that would never happen, but we could both agree to, right? And we saw like, I'm listening to my side, and he's listening to his side, and we're both just sticking to our sides out of fear, and realizing that we are getting told by somebody else who has an agenda, and that these two people on opposing sides really can both be brought to the middle, and we're being influenced by people who don't want us to compromise.
No, I really like that point, so I skipped to this one, because like when you're in a situation where you feel under attack, a lot of times it can be tempting to use the same strategies. Those same emotions can suspend your logic. I have a different presentation about like how to maintain a good conversation, but like you do have to reflect, like, are you feeding into the emotion? Because as just a quick advice, like if you want somebody to be calm, you got to present a calm exterior, because when both people start getting upset, you just see the temperature in the room go right up. And like I said, it can be just a symptom that you have issues with your organization as well that need to be addressed. That the way people get what they want is through these tactics instead of talking it out and actually sitting down. And so it's very good to be reflective. I do know this particular one has a little focus on like seeing tactics as they come, but as you know, nothing in life is black and white. Thank you very much.
Can I add something to that?
Go for it.
It's interesting. I appreciate that perspective. It's one of the interesting. My role as superintendent, and I'm a new superintendent. But one of the things is maybe a little bit more of an observer in interactions. Like, frankly, whether it's board members or even just community members as a whole, one of the interesting things is when I get to see both perspectives, because both perspectives will come to me with their, their thoughts and whatever. But and what's so interesting to me is how often it sure seems like these two sides or two people or whatever it is, of this disagreement have far more in common than not. And it's, how do you help them see that?
Right.
But it's, so I appreciate that perspective, because that's one of the things that always occurs to me. It's like, I visited with both of you, and I think you have a lot more values and thought processes in common than you have differences, and you maybe don't realize that. But so I appreciate.
And there's some psychology on that. Like a lot of times, the things that people get the most mad about are where they're similar on most things, but this one thing, we just can't get past this one thing. So yeah, that's an interesting dynamic. One thing I forgot when I was talking about rumor spreading, my personal opinion on that is always to get good information out there. There was a time in my life where I thought if I just kept my head down, worked really hard, that life would work like a Thomas the Tank Engine episode, by the end of it, everybody see it was a really useful engine and life would go on. It doesn't work that way. I wish it did, but it's really important to get your information out there, and like I said, focus on your good, focus on your supporters. Don't get bogged down with somebody that's in an illogical state of mind. I mean, do your best to bring them to the table, but don't let that person drive the ship, is what I'm saying. Because that can happen. We focus on that one person that's going to have a problem with our initiative, this one person that's going to have a problem with this course of action, and instead of putting energy into everybody else who is at least some degree on board, it's kind of like giving them this rein and saying, hey, would you let us know if we can leave the dock? So that's just advice. So one part of this presentation, and particularly when I was going through the whole pandemic, I'm sure a lot of you have this, like you're under a lot of stress. And so it's important to reflect, like you said, but also see what sort of effect it might be having on you. Because sometimes we can handle these really well and be like a champion, and sometimes we make small mistakes, and we hear about it for the next few years. And we all make mistakes, so that's one thing I want to take. You all make mistakes. We need to have some grace, and we need to give other people some grace. We need to learn from our things and move on, not treat people like they're black and white either. So overworking was one that I fell into, where, like I said, I thought I just worked really hard, and so turned out putting 50, 60 hours in a week didn't make people happy with me. So, but you know, that starts to bleed into your family time, your time with your spouse and stuff like that, and like, you start putting your own needs behind. So a lot of times your loved ones can be a good one to tell you like, hey, you need to dial it back a little bit. Perfectionism is similar to overworking in far as its motive, but like, it's like, if I just hit, if this email is absolutely perfect, no grammar mistakes, I hit all these keys, we'll be good. But it's not healthy to be held to that kind of standard. Like I said, at some point, you're gonna get your wrong there in there. I had one survey I had sent out, and one of the responses came back, your grammar is a sign of the decline of the district. Fun fact, it's not my strong suit. I was just sort of like, really? That seems a little bit dramatic. You can fall into seeking revenge, and then you can fall into wanting to get back at people, and then your behavior becomes illogical, and sometimes you just gotta step back, breathe, and try to get back to the facts. Because a lot of times, with those emotions, and my other presentation really gets into it, you naturally start telling yourself a story to support how you feel. This person wakes up every morning to make my life miserable. I know it because of X, Y, Z. Chances are that the person doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I really want to make Mr. Ludvigson's life horrible. What can I do today? They might be really upset about a thing and they're thinking of a way to get back at you, but chances are that person who's upset is telling themselves stories, and there's probably misunderstandings, misfacts, those sorts of things involved. Martyrdom. I find in education that we have sometimes an unhealthy relationship with sacrifice, that we want other people to see that we're working harder than everybody else. We want to convince people that we're irreplaceable. And so the reflection piece I find that's useful is if you think you need to be holding the biggest burden, you need people to see that you're under the most pressure so that they know how important you are, you're probably falling into martyrdom. Take a day off, relax a little bit, ask people for help. So with that, I have this phrase I sometimes use, I call it Superman and Wonder Woman syndrome. That's when you find yourself thinking you're the only person that can solve the problem. And it's kind of funny because now sometimes I watch the superhero movies and I'm like, you know, he has a whole team. Why doesn't he bring the team with? And so sometimes we can fall into that where we don't take our help. Like, our help isn't perfect, so we need to do it to make sure it's perfect, that sort of stuff. Advancement, sometimes you can fall into, like, we really want to get into a particular place, so we put up with bad behavior, we put up with crap assignments. But sometimes you have to step back and like, is this worth it? And is this getting me to put toward my goal, or am I just being taken advantage of? Self-medicating. So, I think mental health's been a big topic. I suffer from depression, so it's taken me a long time to get to a point where I just can say that. But sometimes when we're in a really stressful situation, we can turn to all kinds of things to help try to give us a temporary relief from that situation. So maybe it's spending a lot of time on your phone. Maybe it is drinking. Maybe it is a lot of medications to help you control your anxieties. Whatever it is, the important thing is, like, is it actually helping you, or is it a destructive behavior that is making things worse? And that's, again, where it's good to have loved ones be like, hey, like, even when you're home, you're not home, you're playing with your phone. That sort of stuff. And I found reflecting, like, if my motivator in there was just to, like, make everything stop for a little bit so that I could have, like, a little moment of peace with my thoughts, it's probably not a good sign. So, seek help. Make sure you have mentors and allies and people to talk to. But, like, just be honest with yourself is what I'm saying with that. And it can be a sign of chronic stress. And I know one of the times when I was under a significant amount of stress, my dentist told me I needed to get under control or I was going to need a mouth guard when I went to bed. And I'm sure a lot of us have had some of that, you know, stomach cramps, or I know one thing that happened to me once in a while was I'd get just a standard cold, and I'd be sick for like 2 weeks. I just wasn't bouncing back. I also wasn't stopping working. Sometimes you need to rest and recharge because you're no good to anybody burned out. And I know a lot of people use that word self-care, but it is important because a lot of times we ask the people that are good at delivering to do the most because we can count on them. We can rely on them. And that other person over there that never gets a job assignment done, we try to give them as little as possible. And most of you are probably the person that will say, yes, I'll help out, because you're here.
I have another comment on this one. When you look at perfectionism and, what was the one, I don't know, when you think about some of the, go ahead, maybe revenge was
Okay.
underneath that.
Yeah.
I think it's good, like for a superintendent maybe, to have the director of, say, teaching and learning, to be somebody you can really trust to give you feedback. I'm a board member and I have somebody else on the board that can call me and say, okay, Sarah, this is what I heard you say. Is that really what you meant? And this is what I'm seeing you doing, right? Like I think you need to have an ally that you can trust to be honest with you and that you know they're not doing it for their advantage, but to help you when you can't be self-reflective. And so I would encourage everybody to find somebody that can, I don't know, be that honest person.
You're like a step ahead of me.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's great. This is a slide, the last time I did this, I skipped because I ran out of time. However, seek out emotionally intelligent people that can tell you that you've gone down the dark side, please come back. Because when you're in it, particularly when you've hit that stress level where you're seeking those things and try to comfort yourself, a lot of times you don't see it because you're too deep in it. Too far into wonderland, you need somebody to throw down the rope and say, hey, come back. People that love you are over here. We're still around here. And so having those allies, and you've mentioned it before, this is more on my relationship slide, but having people that have other opinions around you as leaders is good. But if you just gather people around you that are, say, yes people, that they're not going to give you a good perspective on things.
Who is that person for?
What?
Who is that person for the superintendent, particularly in a small school district where the cabinet is, you know,
I 100%
the
understand.
district office staff? Because I agree. I'm just curious, like, you know, where do you look for that when it's, you know. I don't know what the size of your district is, or if there's other superintendents in the room.
I have
I'm
more
curious.
now, but my last 5 years, my admin teams were me and my neighbor.
Oh,
Well,
But-
I guess I come from which I consider a small school, but I mean, you have some, whether it's, like I have a high school and elementary principal.
Yep. That's
I
kind of where I lean.
would sure hope you have, a trusting, not that you have to agree, they have jobs to fight for their school and fight for their teacher, but we have to come together and we're gonna make some decisions and recommend some stuff. In the same thing, hey, if I'm missing something, you need to, tap me, because I'm gonna tap you too and go, hey, I'm thinking about this, right? I mean, it's just an example, you could be a business manager, it could be, but to me, it's the people we work most with, that hopefully they can.
There's probably not a
They're off
set
their
answer.
rocker right now, in the same, doesn't mean a bad thing, we all get there.
Yeah.
maybe your admin assistant, especially if they've been in the job for a long time, they can give you more, they know a lot more than I think.
You know, it's really great to have that person be somebody in your district. I know I've had the benefit of a few times where the retired superintendent stuck around and was willing to talk to me. And like business managers, maybe even your secretary is that person. It's somebody that can hold your confidence. So you'll know if they're holding your confidence because you'll tell them something. And I won't lie, there's been times where I've been like, hey, so-and-so, here's some information. And then it pops up somewhere out later. All right, you're off the list of people I trust. I'll tell you stuff, but it'll be maybe a little filtered. You gotta have those people you gotta be honest, you can be honest with, where you don't have to do the whole song and dance that we have to do sometimes, where you just can maybe let out a few words that are maybe not, appropriate once in a while to express your feelings. So on this one, displaying good discernment is a great way to get allies, get people that support your decisions. and it was a word in the book where people, aspects of it are you show respect for others. I grew up on a farm. My parents always taught me, you know, show respect for everybody. Be nice to your waitress. Be nice to your custodians, whatever. Everybody deserves some respect. Be that person. Displaying competence and knowledge and ability to do one's job. That one's fairly straightforward. Know how to do your job. And show people that you can, that can kind of overlap a little bit with that rumors one. Make sure you let people know what you're doing, because sometimes people will assume things or insert their own details, and that can sometimes turn into its own animal. Personal regard for others. Show that you care about people around you. Ask them about their day. Not everything has to be about business. And integrity. Be honest. Even when it's hard. That's when it's the most important. One piece of advice I kind of touched on earlier, but if you keep to the high road, you keep reflecting, stopping yourself falling into those traps, over time, people will see that you stick to your guns, that you fight for what you believe, and they'll have a lot more respect for you than if they feel like you're driven by whatever winds of change, or like you're doing this just so so-and-so doesn't make your life miserable. That never happens, but you keep it in check. I put nepotism exists in there because, like I know my earlier slide said, it's bad. Like, it's just bad if it's influencing bad decisions. It's good to have connections. It's good to have people around you that have relationships and stuff. Just like make sure it doesn't become like a thing that gets people into places where they shouldn't be, or behaviors get overlooked because of connections. Make sure people are held accountable despite who they're connected to. And get to know people, learn people. Kind of back up then to this slide. You don't want to gather allies while you're under fire. You want to do that well before. So that's what that slide was about. So, don't know what that means? hopefully nothing like starting a fire. So like attracts like you were saying, make sure you gather diverse people around you, because they give you diverse perspectives, especially running a school. You have a lot of different types of people involved. But we're human beings. We like people like us. We like to talk about people with the same interests. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as you keep it in check. Failing to meet expectations is more of something that might suddenly make a lot of people who are not connected. Like, you know, you're being a principal and people are upset with the discipline policy, and these various people are all upset with the same thing, but otherwise they're not too familiar with each other. So, especially in our, I assume that's useful in any community, but like recognizing connections can help you connect the dots. And so the book covers 3 ways that people generally end up being connected in some way. The simplest is actually the third, neutral. It could just be that you go to the same coffee shop, or you go to a class or whatever. You're just around each other. And actually, one of the traits to like developing relationships with people is being familiar with them. You know, there's also time and other things that go into that. But like being around them, the important thing about that is it could turn into something else. Positive, that one's pretty straightforward. That's good stuff. You get together to do something good. Negative, it's like perhaps that water cooler that you brought up. You get around because you have a passion for telling everybody about everything that bothers you. Everything. And I do have one bit of recommendation with negativity, and it would be a social media strategy actually is drown it in positivity. Make sure that people that have good things to say are being heard twice as often as the negative people, because it'll still be there, it'll still be whining and complaining, because some people have a hard time seeing the positive, I don't want to tell you. But prevent it from getting momentum. Keep getting good information out there, good facts out there. But yeah, this is good to see how people are connected, because sometimes, like I said, it can get you to where the problem's coming from. And sometimes that prevents you from, like, if you're sick and I give you a medication for something you're not sick with, it's not going to do any good. It's like that. So you're addressing the real problem, because when we start getting our emotions wound up, a lot of times the thing we're screaming at each other about isn't even what we're mad about. It's just something that we're choosing to butt heads over. appreciate how talkative this group is. Every once in a while when I do this, like everybody will wait until after I'm done. So, I know nobody like wants to hear it, but sometimes it happens. And this has to do with the slide about taking care of yourself. Sometimes you end up in a situation you can't win. And the two questions you need to ask yourself is it worth it, and can you prevail? And like I said, you will certainly encounter these situations where if you're fighting for what you believe, fighting for what's right for kids, and somebody will disagree with you and take a beef with you. Or, you just fall into a bad situation. And you certainly have to work and gather those allies and try to keep it, but sometimes it gets away from you. And sometimes you end up in a situation where you need a clean slate or a fresh start. And this slide is here just to remind people that sometimes that's okay. I know how that sounds, but a lot of these strategies will help you manage under fire, but like if you're in those situations where you're chronic stress, your doctor's going to tell you you're going to die from a heart attack if you don't get your stress under control. We're just saying, make sure you take care of yourself. Sometimes you end up in situations like that. People understand what I mean with that. I always worry that maybe they'll think I'm saying just go down the road. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, that's not current information. I forgot to update this last slide. I'm currently a superintendent at Long Prairie Gray Eagle. I have that email address. It's not my current email address, so I apologize. But, Daniel Ludvigson, you'll look me up, you'll find me easy enough. So, kind of go back to that first slide. Make sure you focus on the right calls, because then you can sleep good at night. So even if you're in that stressful situation, because if you start making calls to appease somebody, you don't even feel good about the decisions you make. And that adds to the stress. Listen to your gut, because usually if something's off, there's some problem brewing. And if you can get to it before it turns into some ugly monster that is its own thing, a lot of times you can prevent people from going down that path, and we can sort this out in a logical, sensible way. And it's often not about you. And that helps you, A, not to internalize things, and B, like sometimes when you think it's about you, like I said, you don't actually see the actual problem there, because you think you're doing something wrong. They're telling you you're doing something wrong. Nothing you do is ever right, but it's actually some other thing going on. Like, I had one situation where I don't really understand what I did. I think my best guess was that there was a person that left our district, and for some reason they blamed me for it, which the reason that doesn't make sense was that they had intended to leave since we hired him, so it wasn't my fault. But this one person always was after me at different things. I never understood, because we never had a negative reaction. But I'm pretty sure it was a connected thing. They thought I was responsible for somebody they cared about not being in the district. Which, like I said, wasn't true. It wasn't the fact, but sometimes that happens. We got time for questions?
Yeah, just a public service announcement, pretty obvious, but particularly those for like new enroll. MSBA is really good with our social media policy. If you don't have one or haven't looked at it for a while, I would strongly encourage that. And then you can obviously adapt it to your specific district. That would be, obviously for internal communication, internal use. What happens in the community is obviously outside of control, but if you respond, Canon will be used against you in perpetuity. So screenshot it and text it out, right? But the other thing to know about that is, what seems like this mob on social media is probably just a couple of, the noisy members of the community. So don't overthink it and don't let it be such a distraction. Every district's going to kind of have their culture, but we've got to do this.
That's a very good point, because sometimes it feels like this huge group of people, and if you step back and you reflect, it turns out to be like 3 or 5 people that are just really loud. And that's why it's good to reflect on the organizational health, because if those people get their way by being loud, it certainly won't stop.
Board member once say that if 2 people are upset, that means 98 are perfectly happy.
Yet
To
they're
your-
not the
to your
ones
point.
that,
They're not,
they're
you're
not the
you're
one
not
that do
hearing from the
public
98.
comment, right?
They're not the one, you're not hearing from the 98, but that was just to kind of keep things in perspective, you know, you can chase your tail, trying to, you know, appease the 2.
But
I
the
think
two
a
more
lot of
But,
times
yeah, but then
it's
you
the
forget
same
about
two
the, yeah.
people who are
so.
always upset too.
True.
People who are happy generally don't come to your board meeting because they're happy.
Yeah.
Like, they're doing a good job, they'll just catch you on the street once in a while. Or smile at you, that might be.
So, okay, I'm on the board, and we have someone who shows up every, to every meeting, speaks probably 2/3 of the time to address us, who writes things in the newspaper. Is it worth trying to have a conversation, as a board member, I don't have to, she's not showing up at my office like a superintendent, but is it even worth it to have a conversation with a person?
I'm gonna say it depends,
Okay,
and I'll explain why. Sometimes, if you can figure out what that root thing is, and you can line it up with your goals as a district, we're here for kids, sometimes you can get the person to calm down long enough to have a rational conversation. However, sometimes people are too far into it, or to be honest, some people are having their own personal struggles and stuff, and it's coming out at you, lucky you, and all the logic in the world won't help them. So, sorry for the depends answer, but like, you can get people off that, the earlier you catch them, the better, I'll put it that way. The farther they go down the rabbit hole, the harder it is, that you need more rope.
The question I have for you is, I would say consider the source. Okay, so yeah, this person comes and does this thing at these meetings, but what does the rest of your community, how does the rest of your community view this person? I mean, is this person the one that, oh, yeah, John Smith wrote that letter in the paper again, let's read it because it's gonna be funny, you know, kind of thing? Or is he like someone who has clout and there is a problem and you need to change it? So, you know, there's a lot of times where, you know, I've dealt with things where so-and-so comes in and is mad as all get out, and they walk out, and it's like, well, that's just them being them. And everybody in the community knows that already.
okay, thank you.
I
That
agree
helps.
with that, and one thing that's helped me personally is occasionally I get like some list of, these are all the terrible things with you. They're lovely. But sometimes if you stop and you look at them, if you get really good at leadership, you can pick out the nuggets of truth and work on those. However, if you look through that list and they're all like, what I've learned to tell myself, well, if that's the best they have to complain about, I must be doing a pretty good job. Yeah. But I will say that you might get that sort of feedback from somebody, and it might be a little bit off the rocker, but like, if you do get good at discerning where they have a legitimate concern, you'll be a better leader. You just have to be able to put everything else aside, which is easier said than done. That's one that's helped me. Oh, I guess if that's the best they can